Welcome to the deep dive. We're plunging into some really big questions today, and the one we're tackling might feel unsettlingly close to home for many of you listening. Are Western societies actually truly on the brink of civil war? It's something people whisper about, right? But maybe don't explore with the kind of depth it really needs. So our mission here is to unpack that. We want to extract the key insights, the conditions, the causes, maybe even how internal conflict could play out. And we're drawing on some serious academic research. We've got insights from a leading expert in war studies. This is someone whose work focuses on how countries get, well, torn apart from the inside.
And just to be clear up front, as always on the deep dive, our goal is to explore the ideas, the frameworks presented by the expert. We're not endorsing any particular political view here. We're here to understand the analysis, even when the subject is, difficult or sensitive. Okay, so let's start with our expert's background a bit. Professor in War Studies, King's College London, specializes in insurgency, counterinsurgency. It seems quite striking, though, that someone with that expertise was hesitant initially to talk about this stuff publicly. What's the risk there, this idea of actualizing outcomes? How does that worry kind of shape how you approach this?
Yeah, it's a really important point. I mean, first off, the subject matter is just inherently unpleasant, isn't it? And the way things are right now, socially, politically, it can be quite painful, actually, to discuss these observations openly. The worry about actualizing outcomes, it's this fear that, if you talk about something as a possibility, maybe even likely, people might confuse that, think you want it to happen. Or maybe worse, that talking about it could somehow contribute to it happening. But honestly, I feel I have to share what I'm seeing because the signs, well, they seem pretty significant. And when we talk about insurgency, it's really crucial people understand what that actually means. It's not just, a bomb going off in Kabul. That's the common image, maybe.
Right, the sort of spectacular violence.
Exactly. But think of it more like an iceberg. That visible violence, the bomb, that's just the tiny tip. The real mass, the huge part, is the social movement that's building quietly underneath the surface. That's the bulk of the iceberg.
Okay, so a social movement. But how is it different from, say, a regular social movement like the civil rights movement? What's the line?
That's the key distinction. An insurgency, eventually, deliberately steps beyond the law. That could mean things like destroying property, physical violence, organized riots. It crosses a legal threshold that most social movements don't intend to. And looking at Western countries now, particularly, say, Britain, what I see are signs of what I'd call incipient insurgency, early stages.
Incipient insurgency, what does that look like on the ground?
Well, you see this growing alienation from normal politics. Lots of people just feel politics is broken. You hear that everywhere. There's a sense it just can't solve the big collective action problems anymore, the issues that need everyone pulling together. And solving those usually relies on, well, aggregating different views of the political system. But that system itself needs something deeper. It needs this foundational kind of pre-political loyalty to the nation itself, a basic sense of shared identity and purpose. And that loyalty, in my view, it's eroding, partly, I think, because of what some call the triumph of identity politics. People identify more with subgroups than the nation. And you see this reflected in the numbers, too. Trust in government, in institutions, it's plummeting. For government specifically, it's almost in single figures now.
Wow. Okay. So if that's the incipient insurgency, the sort of simmering movement beneath the surface, how does that potentially escalate? How do we get from that to something as devastating as a full-blown civil war? Because that feels different, right? Not just a spontaneous riot or a quick revolution.
Yeah, absolutely. Good question for clarity. So academically, when I use the term civil war, I mean a specific type of war. It's where the groups fighting each other, well, they were originally under the same sovereign authority, same government, basically, when the conflict started. The key thing is its internal origin. It's a society turning against itself. And you're right, it's not usually sudden like a revolution might seem. Civil wars tend to be long-term things. They have a prehistory. There's usually this long buildup of what I call the tinder, all the stuff that makes the explosion possible later on. That's a process.
Okay, the tinder, that makes sense. It's not just spontaneous combustion. So let's dive into that. What are the core ingredients, the main factors that you see building up this volatile political energy right now in the West?
Well, I focus on three big factors that really contribute to this potential. And the worrying thing, frankly, is that we seem to be right in the sweet spot for all three of them at the moment. The first one, and I think this is the biggest, it's multiculturalism. In my analysis, this is the most important factor, maybe contributing as much as, say, 90% to the problem.
90%, that's a really high figure. And
I mean, it sounds quite provocative. Could you unpack that? Why specifically multiculturalism as such a dominant factor compared to others? Is there specific data or history behind that number?
It's a synthesis, really, looking at past conflicts, looking at current trends. It's not just a simple calculation, more an assessment of its impact. And to be very clear here, I'm not just talking about having a multi-ethnic society. Many countries are multi-ethnic and stable. What I'm focused on is the active promotion of different cultures and values instead of prioritizing integration into a central, sort of dominant national culture.
Okay, so it's the approach to diversity, not diversity itself.
Exactly. Because that approach, in my view, it completely erodes the idea of pre-political loyalty. That shared bedrock commitment to the nation itself, which you absolutely need for a democratic system to actually work. Think of a nation like a big extended family. You need some agreement on core values, a shared future. If that family loyalty breaks down, if different groups put their subgroup identity first, the whole system struggles. People feel less invested. And look, this isn't some radical new idea. Leaders like Angela Merkel, David Cameron, they acknowledged years ago that this particular model had, well, run into trouble, called it a disaster even.
Right, I remember those comments.
And this connects to something I call the bell curve vulnerability. Picture a bell curve representing societal stability. At one end, you have very homogeneous societies. Pretty stable, usually easier to get consensus. At the other end, very, very diverse societies where no single group holds sway. They can also be relatively stable. Power is too fragmented for easy conflict. But the most dangerous spot, the peak of the curve, the most vulnerable state, that's when you have a formerly dominant majority which is in fear of losing its status.
Losing status, like language, culture?
Exactly. Language, cultural norms, maybe religious beliefs, political power, they feel it's slipping away. But crucially, they still have the potential muscle, the numbers of resources, to try and reverse the situation. It's like this boiling pot, you know? One big group feels threatened, but still strong enough to fight back hard. And that's fertile ground for the replacement or displacement narrative you hear about. It leads to this really sharp clash, doesn't it, between those saying we want our country back and others, often using pretty harsh language themselves, basically telling them to shut up.
Okay, so multiculturalism, understood in that specific way, is factor one. What's the second?
The second is factionalism, especially what I call polar factionalism. Now, factionalism itself just means acting based on your group's interests over the national interest. It's like being a lodger living in the house who only cares about themselves, not the whole household. An example I've used is seeing, say, MPs in Britain lobbying hard for an airport in Pakistan. It seems like prioritizing an external factional interest.
Okay, but what makes it polar?
Polar factionalism is the worst kind. It's when the arguments stop being about the issue at hand. Instead, people argue purely based on what their faction believes. Your position is just a badge of loyalty to your side. It becomes an expression of extreme insecurity. Your own conscience, your own judgment gets buried because the perceived danger from the other side feels so immense you have to stick with your group no matter what. And honestly, when you reach that point, where the different sides can't even agree on basic facts or acknowledge legitimate concerns from the other side, the next step after polar factionalism is the war. Because politics, compromise, it just becomes impossible. There's no shared reality left.
That's chilling. And the third factor?
The third one is the loss of faith in normal politics. Basically, the belief that the system can actually solve problems. Legitimacy is the secret sauce, you know. And governments know this. They measure it themselves. The data is stark trust in political institutions is in the cellar. We talked about the single digits. When a government has legitimacy, it can function at low cost. People comply voluntarily. Like, you know, British police traditionally not needing guns. People generally respected the authority. But without that legitimacy, government has to become more muscular. It starts policing speech more, policing actions more. Why? Because people are saying and doing things they never would have said or done when they actually trusted the system to work fairly.
Okay, so those are the three big factors building the tinder. But you also mentioned that the traditional barriers, the things that usually prevent civil conflict, are weakening. It's pretty unsettling to think about things like wealth or even competent leadership starting to crumble as defenses. How does that actually happen? What's the mechanism there?
Yeah, exactly. Those barriers are eroding. Take wealth, for instance. Historically, it's been a kind of social lubricant. It allows a society to, paper over a lot of cracks. You can buy off discontent, fund programs, ease tensions with money. But my sense is, and look, I'm not an economist, but it feels like Western economies are maybe at the end of the rope with financialization.
Yeah.
Creating wealth out of debt, We might be running out of that ability to just appease existing problems by borrowing more. So those underlying problems, they're going to surface more sharply without that cushion.
Right, the money buffer is shrinking.
Then there's this idea of a customary habit of obedience. Some people say, oh, the British are just passive politically. I don't quite buy that. Britain's had plenty of revolts through history. What we did have for a long time was a remarkably unified and rather competent governing elite. They were very skilled, really, at managing dissent, suppressing it, sometimes diverting it, sometimes co-opting it. A real genius for governance, you could say.
But that's changed.
That leads to the third weakening barrier. That unified and competent elite just isn't there anymore. First, arguably they're not competent in the way they once were, facing huge complex problems they struggled to solve. And second, crucially, they're not unified. You see these elite defections. Think about Trump in the U.S. context, a clear break within the elite. Or look at the new political movements popping up in Britain. Advance, reform, restore. These are signals, right? Symptoms of a system where parts of the elite feel the old ways aren't working. You also get this uniparty observation sometimes, where on certain core issues, the established parties seem to close ranks and their true allegiances become, well, pretty obvious. Maybe not to the party base, but to each other. I recall a discussion mentioned between Ed Balls, former Labor Minister, and George Osborne, former Conservative Chancellor, about the Rotherham scandal. The takeaway was they didn't really see it as something to exploit politically against each other, a sort of cross-party consensus that maybe wasn't what the public felt. This fracturing means the elites themselves are starting to look out for number one, looking for their own lifeboats, rather than steering the national ship together.
Okay, so the conditions are optimal, the tinder is dry, the barriers are weaker. What about the spark, then? You said it's unpredictable, but what sort of things stand out to you as potential triggers, given everything else you've described? How do these things actually ignite?
Well, first, I really have to stress again, the tinder, that gigantic ball of political energy that's built up, that's vastly more important than the specific spark. The spark itself is intrinsically unpredictable. Who could have guessed an Algerian fruit seller would kick off the Arab Spring? I just can't know. But if you're asking what could be a spark in the current climate, well, maybe another attack of that sort. Thinking of incidents like the Southport stabbing, awful events where people feel, their children get slashed apart and the system doesn't respond adequately. Or perhaps it's not one big event. Maybe it's a steady drip of increasingly vile revelations, say, from the ongoing inquiries into grooming gangs that affects many, many, many people very deeply. The general feeling I get is that increasingly everyone wants to fight. There's just so much anger. And the extremists on either side, they know how to tap into that. They know how to direct that energy.
And social media's role in all this.
Oh, it's huge. It absolutely contributes to the fracturing of society.
Yeah.
Creates echo chambers, silos, and it allows the extremes to find each other much more easily. That's the long tail effect, right? The internet lets niche groups, even really extreme ones, connect and form viable communities in a way they couldn't before. It aggregates them. Now, thinking about how different sides might act, for the, let's call it the we want our country back side, the pattern I'd anticipate isn't necessarily mass street protests. It might look more like a Latin American dirty war. Think targeted attacks on a noteworthy figure or a series of noteworthy figures. Judges, maybe prominent influencers, media figures, carried out by some kind of unheralded native group, probably operating very offline, avoiding the usual online chatter to evade detection. The really electrifying moment, the one that could really escalate things, maybe when someone goes after a judge, that attacks the very system of law.
That's a very specific and dark prediction.
It's a potential scenario based on how insurgencies operate. Remember, it's a social movement with layers. You have passive supporters, maybe just liking posts online, active supporters sharing info, maybe gathering intelligence, and then you have the adherents, the ones actually prepared to go beyond the law. And you need surprisingly few of those to cause major problems. In terms of tactics, a key operational technique is system disruption.
System disruption.
Yeah. Cities are often the focus here. They can be seen as the locus of the problem, maybe even occupied territory by those who feel alienated. And cities are inherently unstable, right? They depend totally on external resources, food, water, energy, coming in constantly. Modern cities, because they're so huge and complex, are even more vulnerable to this. So system disruption means attacking that infrastructure to cause cascading effects, create chaos. Imagine, for example, switching off the gas and electricity to London every couple of weeks through a winter, just intermittently, unpredictably. The potential consequences, you could have 25, 35,000 people on the street very quickly. Panic, looting, places become completely economically unviable. Think back to the 2011 London riots, but potentially much bigger, more sustained, more targeted.
That is a genuinely terrifying scenario. It really brings home the fragility. But it raises a crucial question for me. Can't the democratic system itself act as a kind of safety valve here? We see movements demanding radical change. Think about Donald Trump's appeal or the Reform Party in the UK. If they get a strong mandate, can't they channel all this anger and frustration and actually fix things before it reaches that breaking point?
That's the optimistic hope, isn't it? And look, I genuinely hope that view is correct. I really do. However, my observations, my analysis, leads me to be more skeptical, unfortunately. I tend to see movements like reform, perhaps even Trump's initial surge, as possibly being a system defense mechanism, more like a pressure valve letting off steam rather than agents of truly fundamental change.
The pressure valve, how so?
Well, take someone like Nigel Farage. Increasingly, based on his recent positions, especially regarding multiculturalism and demographic change, he starts to look more like a status quo figure, surprisingly. There was an instance mentioned, for example, where a reform politician was asked about the projection that white British people might be a minority by 2063 or so. And the response was apparently hesitant, dismissive, something like, well, I'll be dead by then, which suggests perhaps a reluctance to really grapple with that kind of deep, long-term societal shift.
So maybe not the radical change agent some perceive.
Perhaps not on those core issues driving the deeper anxieties. And furthermore, even if genuinely radical reformers do get elected, they run straight into the wall of bureaucratic subversion.
Yeah.
The permanent state, the civil service. It has its own inertia, its own interests. It can obstruct, dilute, slow down agendas it doesn't like. We arguably saw elements of that with Trump's first term. And then there's this final, really tricky problem, what I call the peril of the reformer.
The peril of the reformer.
Yeah, the classic example is Mikhail Gorbachev in the Soviet Union. When a leader acknowledges that things are seriously wrong, that big changes are needed, what happens? People's expectations skyrocket. They suddenly believe massive change is possible, and they want it now. But the system, the state, its ability to deliver on them just can't keep up. Expectations race ahead of reality. And that widening gap between what people demand and what the system can provide, it actually leads to more frustration, more instability, not less. The political system just can't keep pace with the public mood it unleashed.
Wow. That's a deeply sobering perspective on trying to fix things. It implies that even trying to reform, if not done perfectly, could actually make things worse. Have you seen any historical cases where a society did manage to navigate that, to get through that kind of perilous reform without triggering the Gorbachev paradox? Or is it almost like a law of political physics once things get that tense?
That really is the million-dollar question, isn't it? Successful examples of navigating this deep a level of internal fragmentation and distrust through reform alone. They're incredibly rare. Often realigning societies required something more fundamental, like a complete refounding after collapse, or a massive external shock that forced people together. The Gorbachev paradox, that dynamic of expectations outrunning capacity, it seems to be a very strong tendency, almost like a law, as you put it, which is why this buildup of tinder is so concerning. Because once those deep-seated expectations for change are fully unleashed, managing them within the existing, often creaking political structures becomes incredibly, incredibly difficult.
Okay, so wrapping this up, what does all this mean for you listening right now? We've definitely journeyed through some complex and frankly pretty unsettling territory today. Thinking about potential conflict, not somewhere far away, but right here, closer to home, our experts laid out a really compelling, if disturbing case for why Western societies might be nearing these optimal conditions for serious internal trouble, from trust completely eroding to elites fracturing to the very foundations of national loyalty seeming to wobble. It's a sobering picture and a powerful reminder that maybe the tinder, those underlying conditions, is really what we need to focus on, much more than waiting for a specific spark.
Absolutely. And perhaps that leads to one final thought, a provocative one for you to maybe mull over. Beyond just navigating the current turmoil, maybe the question is, what kind of country do we want to be afterwards? Because this period, however painful it might be or become, is not going to last forever. Things will change, one way or another. So putting some serious thought in now about what a desirable future actually looks like on the other side of this, that might actually be quite useful.
A really powerful thought to end on. What comes next? What do we want to build? We definitely encourage you to keep reflecting on these huge questions. Seek out more understanding. Think about how societies might drift into conflict, but also maybe how they can deliberately try to shape a more positive future. Thanks for joining us on The Deep Dive.